Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. There are new questions about how Ottawa is responding to Iran's regime after the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini. Scenes like this in Iran have also sparked protests here at home, with Iranian Canadians calling for a tougher response from the federal government.
We want action! We want action! We want action!
Calls for more action now echoed by the leader of the opposition.
Will the Prime Minister have the guts to stand in today and announce he's banning this terrorist organization?
So tonight we're asking, how damaging could Iran be as a foreign policy issue for this government, and how can it be used against them politically? So let's bring in at issue Chantal Hebert, Andrew Coyne, and Althia Raj. Elamin is away this week. Good to see everyone. Althia, I'm going to start with you on this one. How do you think that the Liberal government's history with Iran is damaging them this week, or how is the opposition using it to try and damage them this week?
Well, the Liberals did support a motion several years ago now to label the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization, and they have not done anything. I assume that's where you're leading me with that. Mm-hmm. But I actually think that this speaks to a more fundamental problem to the answer that you posed in the setup piece here. Mm-hmm. This is a government that has taken a lot of pride as being seen as a feminist government, a feminist prime minister. And we've kind of reached this point in the government's tenure where they seem to be no longer setting the direction. I think that there are legitimate reasons why the government would decline to use such a label. Some of the reasons that the media has been given is, for example, if you had someone that did compulsory military service, that individual residing in Canada, for example, might have a really hard time sending money back home. There are, concerns, legitimate concerns, that you could see why the government would not necessarily take that stand. But I think you can ask yourself the question, who is steering the ship? And more and more, it seems like the government is relying on the public service, and it itself is not setting the direction. And so I think that this speaks to a greater problem, frankly, that starts at the head in the Prime Minister's office, where there is a sense that the government is directionless, that it is rudderless. It is something you hear MPs complain about all the time. And so I think this is an indication of that greater problem.
We should say the government has announced new sanctions against Iran, but hasn't gone as far as imposing that terrorist label. Chantal?
But beyond the maybe rudderless and talking points, why cannot this government on this issue, but not only on this issue, just explain or account for itself in a way that goes beyond the talking points? And that's been a problem since 2015, but it's becoming acute. If they have legitimate reasons, and it's possible that they do, rather than sources using journalists as mouthpieces, why don't they just explain them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point, Andrew. We've been trying to ask ministers that question all week, and no one seems able or perhaps willing to articulate the complexity or the difficulty or whatever people are saying behind the scenes to us around doing this.
Yeah, and it's not just what the government has done or not done in the last week or the last month, but in the last 7 years. As mentioned, that resolution on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard question was in 2018. Yeah. If there were nuances and difficulties and carve-outs you needed to do for that policy, you've had 4 years to do it, and there only seem to be getting around to talking about it or thinking about it now to all outward appearances. This is, by the way, not just a question about Iran, but this government came to power promising it was going to take a sort of a softer, more gentler, more cooperative approach to a lot of these questions. It was not going to draw such harsh line in the sands as its predecessors on things like China, on things like the Middle East, et cetera. Well, it hasn't really paid a lot of obvious benefits, and it's had to rethink some of these things, certainly on China, for example, and I think it's in the process of rethinking it on Iran. If it was just a matter of what's going on now, I think the international community generally has been kind of caught flat-footed by the Iranian protests, because it kind of arrived at an inconvenient time, if I can put it that way, with the war in Ukraine, with North Korea lobbing missiles over Japan, et cetera. And there's only so much bandwidth. And of course, the other thing that will be uppermost in certainly President Biden's mind is they're trying to also at the same time as this to negotiate restrictions on Iran's ability to develop nuclear weapons. Yeah. So it's a complicated thing. But as to come back to what my colleagues have been saying, lay out the complications, lay out your policy, formulate one at the first time, so it doesn't just look like you're just like a deer caught in the headlights, which is what the government looks like right now.
So we went.
The problem is.
Yeah, go ahead, Chantal.
The problem is that it makes them, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, look like they aren't in charge of any files because they can't account for anything that's more complicated than saying we will do whatever we are in support of. And the message from that is they think voters are stupid.
I want to play a clip from Question Period today because there was a moment at least where the Liberals were on the offensive, and that's when Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Trudeau traded these quips over reports that the Conservative leader, or at least his website during the campaign, had been using these misogynistic tags to attract misogynistic groups to his YouTube video. Anyway, here's how that exchange went.
Conservative leader has been purposefully using his videos to appeal to far-right misogynistic online movements. These are anti-women movements, and they have had devastating real-life consequences.
I condemned this organization, and I corrected the problem as soon as it became known to me, Mr. Speaker. But I condemn all forms of misogyny, including when the Prime Minister fired the very first female Indigenous Attorney General.
So, I mean, I play that because Iran, Pierre Poilievre had done a good job on Iran during the week in terms of pushing the government, and then the government was given something to use to push back on. Althia?
This is the first time since Pierre Poilievre became leader that you have really the government destabilizing the leader of the official opposition. Like Pierre Poilievre has been very successful over the past few weeks in leading the narrative in Question Period in the House of Commons, frankly. And for all this talk about, liberal backbenchers wanting the government to finally frame Pierre Poilievre, they got a big gift today with that global news story. And I don't think Mr. Poilievre responded very well to it. I mean, it's kind of strange to me that he would say that he condemns that organization. There's no organization per se to condemn. So it's an interesting parsing of words, but it gave you a real idea of what the next election campaign might look like. It was really nasty with Mr. Poilievre going back at the Prime Minister on blackface and brownface. It was not a good day for the official leader of the opposition, but it also wasn't a good day for the Prime Minister.
François Legault's Coalition Avenir Québec formed government once again this week.
Merci, merci, merci. Merci tout le monde.
But despite securing a strong majority with 90 out of a possible 125 seats, the CAQ received 41% of the popular vote. Results that have some opposition parties and others in that province calling for electoral reform. So tonight we're asking, what will it take for electoral reform to be seriously considered in this country? Let's bring in at issue Chantal, Andrew, and Althia. We'll start with Andrew because it's one of his favorite topics. I think that's fair to say, Andrew. Let's talk. We've talked about it before. Let's talk about it in this instance and why it's worth talking about it again, given what unfolded in Quebec.
Well, it's another in a string of elections, but that produced very strange and anomalous results. And this is particularly galling when you see not only the result for the CAQ, but the Liberals having finished fourth with a historic low of 14% of the vote, our official opposition, while the Conservatives, who had 14 or 13 point something percent of the vote, get no seats and down the line. It's not going to change anytime soon. Certainly the CAQ, despite the fact that they promised it last time around, he's now making a virtue of promising not to do it, as if that somehow made him a man of principle. But as we see, governments that get elected under the current system tend to be the ones that benefit from its distortions. Yeah. So it will take a particular alignment of the planets to get enough parties with enough interest in changing the system who get a control of a majority of the seats in one or another of the legislatures for it to happen. That doesn't mean it's never going to happen. I think the accumulation of evidence is certainly tilting things slowly towards it. We're getting more and more anomalous results as we move further and further away from a two-party system. We're now into 3, 4, 5, 6-party politics. And the more parties you have in a legislature, the stranger the results you get from first past the post. I think, and certainly the quality of debate and the level of public knowledge in this is yards ahead of where it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. But I think the only thing that will finally get the ball rolling is if we can get some level of government somewhere. It could be a city, could be a province, that changes the voting system in some way. Because the biggest advantage the status quo has, it's the status quo. We only have first past the post at every level of government in this country. And so a lot of people think that's really the only system there is. And when you start to propose alternative models that are in use by 90 countries around the world, everyone treats it as if it was the first time this had ever been discussed on the planet.
Yeah, it's hard.
So if we can break that, bring in ranked ballots or something like that just to get the ball rolling, then we could perhaps have a more substantive discussion and there'll be more chance of real reform.
But we've seen time and again, and you pointed to it there, that once a winner wins with a particular system, it's hard to give up the system that brings you into power and will keep you there. Chantal, do you feel like what happened on Monday in Quebec is shifting the conversation in any way?
Sadly, I'm old enough to have been around when the Parti Québécois in 1976, for all those who were not born, came to power promising to do this. I fear that it's become the equivalent of our Medicare conversation. You can't touch it because you point to the US whenever you talk about doing something differently. And this has become the debate where you always point to Israel or Italy. But what I can tell you for sure is it's not going to be happening in the National Assembly in Quebec anytime soon, or certainly not over the next 4 years.
Althia?
Well, I agree with that. I can't see that happening at all. But it is, quite galling that you have a party in opposition sign a deal with other minority parties who are also in opposition, obviously, saying, I'm going to reform the system. And then once they get elected with that system, say, oh, no, just kidding. I do think, though, that if the Conservative Party in Quebec sticks around and continues to make this an issue, I mean, it is very obvious to everybody looking at this map now that it is completely distorted, that you would have a party that gets more popular support, that has fewer seats than the official opposition, the Liberal Party. I'm talking about Québec solidaire here, that you would have a party that has 13% support, get no seat, a party that has almost 15% of support in the electorate, get only 3 cents or 2% of the seats in the National Assembly. Like, this is grossly unfair, and people's votes are not counting the same. And so I do think that it's interesting because it keeps the discussion going. I don't think, I agree with Chantal, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. But, if Justin Trudeau is listening and he just heard Andrew Coyne say that if there were ranked ballots, that would be a great thing. I mean, maybe you're giving him an idea to run on because he suddenly decided that, if I had gone ahead with my plan for ranked ballots, everything would be great. It's just, I think we all need to realize that we shouldn't believe politicians who promise these things and get elected in a system that benefits them.
Chantal.
Okay, so 2 points. I don't believe you can move to electoral reform federally with only one party saying, I want to do ranked ballots because it's going to be great for me, which would have been the situation if the Liberals had tried to push it. I don't think that's the way to go about it. Second, how many votes did François Legault lose over breaking that promise before the election? Oh, 0. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, that's the problem. But there is a risk, Andrew, I think, to Althia's point, of voters seeing that their vote counts differently depending on who they vote for and where they live, that not all votes end up, equal in some ways. And I wonder if that is not sort of will contribute to voter apathy or disenfranchisement. I mean, it didn't in Quebec, so maybe I'm making my own point, but I don't know if it could.
Well, part of it is there's so many things we just kind of take for granted as being part of how elections work that are crazy. For example, every election, we in the media tell you about which are the battleground ridings versus the safe seats. Yeah. And it never occurs to anybody to say, wait a minute, isn't every riding supposed to be a battleground riding? Aren't they supposed to be fighting for votes and fighting for seats everywhere in the country, not just in a handful of ridings? Or we take it for granted that, you can't vote for the party you really want to support because you might split the vote. So therefore you have to vote strategically, i.e. vote for some party you don't really like, but you hope will beat another party you hate even more. The things that we take for granted in our system are things that are entirely produced by our system. And our system is, in fact, not the only one there is. It's one that very few countries on this earth use. So it's an education process. It's not going to happen overnight. I just want to make clear, I'm not actually proposing ranked ballots as an appropriate reform. I'm just saying get something somewhere that isn't the status quo somewhere in the country.
I mean,
so that we can break
yeah.
this idea that this is the only system there ever is.
I mean, it would make election night much more compelling if we had to look at more than 30 ridings to see where the vote was going to go. Chantal?
Well, the voters are not equal. The Magdalene Islands, and this isn't just the Quebec example, with, 12,000 people have as much way as my riding in downtown Montreal, and that is the way that Canada is kind of set up provincially. But second, if you're going to have that conversation, you will have a conversation about the fact that a lot of voters crave stability and stable governments, and you can't escape that particular notion.
Last word to you, Althia, on that.
2 points. On preferential ballot, I agree. I don't think the Liberal government would have been able to pass this without the support of other parties in the House. But they never made the case to the country. They never tried in committee to make this case. And when you think about it, like, the UCP is a preferential ballot. The Liberal Party is a preferential ballot. The NDP is a preferential ballot. The Conservative Party choosing their leader is a preferential ballot. Like, we use preferential ballots all the time. There is a case to be made. The government was just not making it. And the other thing I will say is that the voting distortions that we saw on Monday night in Quebec, they do matter because they freeze out voices in the National Assembly. So lots of people who voted for representative don't actually have speaking time in the House at the moment. And so they'll have to find a way to make sure that these voices are represented. Otherwise, people will just get angry and angry. And we already have a legitimacy problem, not just journalists, but politicians as well. And I think this feeds into that whole conversation.
See, that was a lot more fun than I expected, and I knew it would be because of you guys. Okay, thank you very much. I'll see you back here next week.